world history, and today we will be discussing Cuba and U.S. foreign relations. It is important to realize that this is more than just Cuban cigars and pigs. Cuba used to be foreign to people of America, but recently with the historic visit of President Obama, it seems that the relationship between the two is slowly building. Cuba is an hour-away flight from Miami, Florida, and its close presence was one of the major factors that made the country so desirable to the United States of America. Now let's take a closer look at the start of the relationship between the two. From our favorite historian Howard Zinn, he states that the U.S. government's favorite methods of rulers for keeping the people from redressing the domestic wrongs is using war as a way of expansion, in this case, the Spanish-American War. With Zinn's analysis in the quote from Theodore Roosevelt, written in 1897, he says, "I should welcome almost any war, for I think a country needs one." The advent of war seems inevitable, but in addition to this, there was always an underlying desire for U.S. expansion, for more natural resources, and a new venture for U.S. economy. The immediate cause that sparked the start of the Spanish-American War was the mysterious bombing of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. However, there were several other long-term causes that plunged the U.S. into a full-fledged war. On April 11, 1898, President McKinley asked for authorization from the U.S. Congress to stop fighting in Cuba between the Spanish forces and the rebels, and maintain order and establish a stable government. U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution that acknowledged the Cuban independence, mandated the Spanish government to give up control of the island, and allowed President McKinley to utilize any military measures necessary to guarantee Cuba's independence. Because the Spanish government rejected the U.S. ultimatum, President McKinley enforced a naval blockade in Cuba on the 22nd and 125,000 military volunteers. On the same day, Spain declared war on the United States. The war officially ended 4 months later when the U.S. and the Spanish government signed the Treaty of Paris. This settlement allowed the U.S. to purchase the Philippines for $20 million, to take control over Guam and Puerto Rico, and Spanish relinquished its claim over Cuba. The U.S. victory marked its entrance into the Pacific. I mean, America is great. Or is it great? Although the switch of control also caused a series of strikes and revolts in the new conquests or countries that the U.S. had already taken control of or will take control of. Overall, the U.S. gained a lot of natural resources such as molasses and tobacco, but there was always an increase for tax of these products. Because 80% of Cuban exports were in American hands, there were strikes for thousands of workers in Havana. Even though the U.S. did draft a Teller Amendment in 1898, which promised to make Cuba independent after the war was over, this facade was soon revealed. In 1903, the Platt Amendment was drafted, the amendment which allows America to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it felt necessary, limited Cuba to potential of entering in other treaties, and gave the U.S. access to a military base in Guam Bay. Oh hey, didn't see you there. This is Teddy time. In President Theodore Roosevelt's time, he was known to implement a diplomacy method called the big stick ideology. To speak softly and carry a big stick, he stated, the idea of negotiating peacefully while simultaneously threatening with a big stick as his style of foreign diplomacy, which was used in the pursuit of the canal in Central America. President William Taft's term in 1909 to 1913, he utilized the dollar diplomacy to promote the United States' commercial interests and economic power abroad by guaranteeing loans made strategically to important foreign countries. This created stability and order abroad that would best promote American commercial interests. Moral diplomacy is the diplomatic style of President Woodrow Wilson, which gave support to countries with similar ideals and government practices as the United States. One that was used in Mexico in 1914, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, as well as South American countries. After the Spanish-American War, the world entered World War II, but this guy, He simply declared after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1990, "This is not a peace, it's an armistice for 20 years." And he was right. Similarly, Eric Hobsbawm, a historian, also believed the same thing. He called this the Great War Theory, stating that World War I and World War II was a combined war that lasted for 31 years. During the period of World War II, U.S. foreign policy developed greatly due to the fact that Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed presidency in 1933. Roosevelt is famous for his good neighbor policy. Aw, thanks, I know I'm a good neighbor. In which he implemented in 1933. The policy is literally what sounds like if you're thinking of one of those suburban neighborhoods with neighbors who bring baked goods, except instead of there being neighborhoods, they're actually countries. The good neighbor policy was that of non-intervention and non-interference in the domestic affairs in Latin America. It enforced the idea that the U.S. would be a good neighbor and engage in exchanges with Latin American countries. The main aim of the policy was to improve relations with the nations of Central and South America, but also to create new economic opportunities in the form of reciprocal trade agreements, and to reassert the influence of the U.S. in Latin America. Woo! And since we are specifically talking about a country that rhymes with Cuba, in 1934, in Roosevelt's direction, the 1903 treaty with Cuba, that gave the U.S. the right to stop and march into Cuba whenever they felt like it. The treaty was revoked. The policy was meant to symbolize an attempt to distance the U.S. from early interventionist policies, making them seem like friendly people who like to be polite instead of violent. Alright, so let's fast forward through time, all the way to Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. Fidel Castro is a great example of the great man theory. He theorized that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Castro's rule of socialism, anti-imperialism, and humanitarianism can be considered revolutionary as he secured Cuba's independence from American imperialism. Isn't that such a handsome name? He was president of Cuba from 1976 all the way to 2008. But before he became the president of Cuba, Castro was simply an anti-imperialist rebel wanting to create change in Cuba. Castro's mark of history began in 1953 when he led a force of rebels against the leader of Cuba at the time, Fulgencio Batista. Batista was considered one of Cuba's most progressive presidents. However, Castro's rebellion in 1953 was unsuccessful and was put on trial with the rest of the surviving rebels. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but due to pressure from the political leaders in 1955, Batista released all attackers in the rebellion. His most famous quote from the trial had been that "history will absolve me," arguing in the trial that it was his civic duty to fight back against Batista's dictatorship. Continuing from 1953, the rebellion progressed all the way until 1959, when Castro was finally able to oust Batista. Batista fled Cuba that same year in 1959, ending the revolution as Castro occupied Havana, in order to initiate his resolve to tear down the whole world and build up anew. I don't think he meant it literally, but you get what I mean. Until Castro's victory, the United States had always been a steadfast supporter of Batista's cruel dictatorship. They had opposed Castro's revolutionary movement and developed a program to design his government to avert new Cubans. However, after his victory, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower officially recognized the new Cuban government, but relations between the two governments dissolved rapidly. So begins the rule of Fidel Castro, the man who looks a tad bit like Shia LaBeouf. A time of confusion and chaos, as one of the first acts as Prime Minister of Cuba, nationalized all U.S.-owned businesses, including oil refineries, factories, casinos, etc. Of course, the U.S. did not like this because Cuba was one of the United States' periphery countries because it provided the core country, aka the United States, raw materials such as sugar, which made an important preservative. But this act by Fidel Castro also made all the U.S. businesses under state control. President Eisenhower, in response, placed an economic embargo on Cuba to stop the sugarcane imports from Cuba. This trade embargo was not lifted even with the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy. In fact, in 1961, the Foreign Assistance Act was instated by the U.S., which forbids any assistance to all communist countries, including Cuba, and to any other country which gave assistance to Cuba. It authorizes that the U.S. President the ability to establish and maintain total embargo upon all trade between the U.S. and Cuba. So with all this power, on February 3, 1962, JFK, or under this act, proclaimed an embargo upon all trade between the motherland and Cuba, and prohibits the importation into the U.S. of all Cuban goods and all goods imported from or through Cuba, and the exportation of goods from the U.S. to Cuba. Sorry guys, no more Cuban cigars. But while all this is happening behind the scenes, Eisenhower approved a program in March 1960 that allowed the CIA to train Cuban exiles and some Americans in Guatemala. The goal of this small army of exiles was to overthrow Castro and establish a non-communist government that was friendly to the United States. The leader of these exiles was Jose Mero Cardona. Jose was a former member of Castro's government, and he was supposed to take over the provisional presidency of Cuba if the invasion succeeded, but that didn't entirely work out because, first of all, the loudmouth exiles and Americans told all their friends that eventually went to Miami, and so it was common knowledge in that region. And since Florida is only 90 miles away from Cuba, Castro found out, and this supposedly covert plan, but the U.S. was still oblivious to this fact. So, in February 1961, President Kennedy authorized the invasion, but attempted to disguise the U.S. support. Now, the plan for this invasion was to have 2 airstrikes that would take out the Cuban air bases and have 1,400 men launch a surprise attack in the cover of darkness. There would be multiple forces to cause some confusion, and after they were successful in their invasion, the United States Revolutionary Front would send leaders from South Florida and establish a provisional government. Obviously, the U.S. was a little too cocky because on April 15, 1961, the bombers sent from Nicaragua missed most of their targets and left Castro's Air Force mostly intact. With this failure, JFK canceled the second airstrike and ordered the invasion to continue. On April 17th, the invasion force landed at the beaches along the Bay of Pigs and were immediately under heavy fire. 2 escort ships were sunken and half of the air support was destroyed. And to top that off, bad weather also hampered the ground force. The 1,400 men that landed on the beach were nothing compared to Castro's army of 20,000 that awaited them on the beach. Needless to say, the Bay of Pigs was unsuccessful with the surrender of the Cuban exiles and Americans. The dramatics continue with Castro becoming buddy-buddy with the Soviet Union by allowing them to put nuclear missiles in Cuba just 90 miles away from Florida. I wonder why they wanted that in 1962 during the Cold War. Well, Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Fidel Castro to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, but then U.S. intelligence discovered evidence of these arms buildup. So JFK issued a public warning against the introduction of offensive weapons into Cuba on September 4, 1962. JFK even ordered a naval quarantine, which was actually a blockade. JFK sent a letter to Khrushchev declaring that the U.S. would not permit offensive weapons to be derived in Cuba and demanded that the Soviets dismantle the missile bases and return the weapons to the USSR. Of course, the Soviets didn't say, okay. Instead, Khrushchev responded by saying that the U.S. blockade was an act of aggression and the Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be ordered to proceed. John Scaly reported to the White House that he had been approached by a Soviet agent suggesting that an agreement could be approached in which the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade the island. And that night, not a creature was stirring. Only Khrushchev, who sent a message to Kennedy that was long and emotional and raised the specter of nuclear holocaust, and presented a proposed resolution that remarkably resembled what Scaly reported earlier that day. But once Khrushchev got some rest, he sent another message that any proposed deal must include the removal of the U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. However, Kennedy sent another letter that suggested steps for the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba under the supervision of the UN and a guarantee that the U.S. wouldn't attack Cuba. So, on October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement saying that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. Castro didn't have anything to say in these arguments. He was just kind of left to wait in the bathroom. And that, my friends, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, crash course style. For decades, there have been few changes. Under President Carter, the U.S. opened entry sections in each other's capitals, and he said that anyone wishing to leave Cuba would be welcome in the U.S. So some 125,000 Cubans set off from the island in the so-called Mariel lift. But the U.S. tightened the embargo with a series of measures in the 1980s and 90s. President Clinton was the first president for a while that eased travel restrictions and encouraged cultural exchanges. George W. Bush declared, "We're not waiting for the day of Cuban freedom. We are waiting for the day of freedom in Cuba." When Raul Castro assumed power, Obama expressed his preference for increased ties. And so, we have Obama's visit recently to Cuba, and that letter from Fidel Castro that was very controversial. Thank you. This is Crash Course World History. This is signing off.